Ever wondered about the stock coolers that AMD bundles with some of their processors? How well do they perform? And more importantly, are they sufficient enough to save yourself the cost of an aftermarket cooler? Well, in my previous video, I built myself a gaming system, and the processor that I selected for my build was the Ryzen 7 7700. Now, AMD usually bundles a stock cooler with their non-X processors. So with my 7700, I received the AMD's Wraith Prism CPU cooler as its out-of-the-box thermal solution. The Wraith Prism is a decent enough CPU cooler, so I was really interested to test it if it can actually hold up against the 8-core 7700 processor. And that's exactly what I will be testing in this video. Also, Ryzen processors work well enough at their out-of-the-box stock settings, mainly because of their excellent power efficiency. But if you're willing to dive into the BIOS and tinker a little bit with the settings there is potential for even more performance to unlock. There are features like PBO and Curve Optimizer, which is AMD's one-click overclocking and undervolting solution. And this can be used to tweak the performance of our Ryzen processors. So in this video, I'm also going to be playing a little bit with the PBO and Curve Optimizer settings and try to find the most optimal setting for my system that would extract the maximum possible performance from our 7700 processor while keeping the temperature within my desirable limits. So let's get into it. The Wraith Prism is one of the 3 CPU coolers currently being supplied by AMD with some of their processors depending on the processor you purchase, and it's undoubtedly the best of the bunch. As for the cooler itself, it comes with 4 direct contact heat pipes that transfers heat from the CPU to the grid of metal fins, from where the heat is then dissipated by the 100 mm RGB fan at the top. This fan comes with 2 fan speed modes, as indicated by the letters L and H. This switch can be flipped to change the modes. By default, the fan is set to low speed mode, and I will be initially testing using the low speed mode before switching to high speed later on. The Wraith Prism also comes with some pre-applied thermal paste. Mine had this honeycomb structured pattern for test. Interestingly, this pattern had some gaps in between, and I guess the paste was supposed to spread and fill those gaps while applying pressure on the cooler during installation. But when I removed the cooler after a few days of usage, I found that the stock paste had not spread that much and that there were still gaps which can potentially affect efficiency of the paste. So during my final build, I removed the stock paste and applied my own paste. As for the testing purpose, I'm going to use Cinebench R23 to stress the threads of the 7700 processor. I will also be using hardware info to monitor the frequency, temperature, power consumption, and fan speed of the system. Now, it is important to note that there are a lot of other factors that will affect the temperature and performance of the processor, like the choice of motherboard, cabinet, ambient temperature, etc. So your scores, even if you have the exact same setup, may vary if any of these factors differ. I will also be using another app called the Ryzen Master to monitor the limits hit by the processor during the Cinebench run. For this first run, I have kept everything at stock settings. Let's see how this combination of cooler and processor performs at out-of-the-box settings. Alright, looks like each thread is hovering at around 4.6 GHz, which I think is a little bit less even for stock settings. Maybe my 30 degrees ambient temperature is responsible for that. As we can see in the Ryzen Master, we are actually hitting the power limit for the 7700, which is capped at 88 watts. The TJ Max is at 95 degree and we are currently hitting about 80. But to check the max temps that the stock settings can hit at full load, we need to let the test run for some time. We have completed about 2/3 of the test. So let's check where things stand. It seems we have hit a maximum of 84 degrees for the CPU. Currently we are sitting at around 83 degrees. The frequency is still about 4.58 to be precise, a reduction of about 20 to 30 MHz since the start of the test. By the way, the Wraith Prism is at 100% load and spinning at around 2900 RPM. Alright, let's finish the test and check what scores we get. So, the scores at the end of this run is 17,469 points, which honestly is a bit underwhelming. So let's dive into the BIOS and see if you can improve things a bit. The BIOS UI will differ for different motherboard manufacturer. For our next test, I am going to enable PBO or Precision Boost Overdrive in the advanced CPU settings. This removes the PPT limit and allows the CPU to draw more power and boost clocks further. But this also generates more heat and the cooler performance is really tested. Let's save the changes and boot into Windows. Now as you can see in the Ryzen master, the PPT limit is removed and now it's showing 420 watts. Of course, realistically this processor will never pull that much power. But as we'll see in a moment, there are other factors which limits the processor way before the PPT limit is hit. Let's start the run. Alright, the CPU immediately hits 95 degrees, which is the TJ max. The clocks are also higher at 4.8 GHz on course compared to our previous run. Alright, the clocks are at 4.7 now. It has already started to throttle to maintain the 95 degree TJ max. The CPU package power is around 105 watts, at least in this initial part of the run. The Wraith Prism is clearly struggling to maintain these values, and there will be further reduction in power draw and frequency as we progress with the run. Here is the final score, 18,052 points with PBO enabled, a bump of about 400 points, but at a much higher temps of 95 degrees. Here is a quick comparison between the two runs. Next, let's enable Curve Optimizer and see how much things improve. To enable Curve Optimizer, go to Advanced CPU Settings in BIOS, Precision Boost Overdrive, and this time we'll change the PBO value from Enabled to Advanced. A bunch of new options will appear. Go to Curve Optimizer and change the value to all cores and the sign to negative. As for the magnitude, this actually depends on the silicon quality of your CPU, how high a negative offset it can sustain. I will try 30 and see if things are stable. If not, I will lower the magnitude to maybe 20 or 15. Earlier, minus 30 was the max possible offset, but AMD now allows even greater magnitude values or offsets. To explain how Curve Optimizer works, let's assume that this is a voltage frequency curve that a processor is currently following. The voltage frequency curve is built in the system by the CPU manufacturer and it dictates the frequency the processor will boost to at a particular voltage. Of course, this curve here does not represent an actual voltage frequency curve, and I just prepared this arbitrary curve to roughly explain what's going on behind the scenes when you enable Curve Optimizer. So let's say at a particular scenario, the processor is drawing 1.24 volts, and as per the curve, the processor will boost to 4.8 GHz. Now if we enable Curve Optimizer with a negative offset of 30, the voltage frequency curve actually shifts 30 units along the negative voltage axis. In this offset curve, we can see that while drawing the same voltage of 1.24 volts as earlier, the processor can now boost to 5 GHz, as the voltage drawn is directly proportional to the power draw. So by introducing a negative 30 Curve Optimizer, we are essentially allowing the processor to boost further at roughly the same power draw. Conversely, you can also achieve same performance or clock speeds at lower voltage requirements, which translates to less power draw. But this method does have its drawbacks. When the CPU is not under load, the lower frequency clocks sometimes can have less voltage to work with if the Curve Optimizer is set to a very aggressive value. It all comes down to finding the sweet spot for your processor, which also depends on the silicon quality of your processor. So this is roughly how Curve Optimizer functions. So let's move ahead with our test. Alright, you know the drill. Open Cinebench and start hammering the cores. Once again, we are thermally limited to 95 degrees, but looks like we have surpassed the 5 GHz mark, although it's only the beginning of the run. The CPU PPT is around 107 watts. Not a great difference from the last run, but the higher frequency is mainly due to the voltage frequency curve shifting by negative 30 millivolts, and now the processor is boosting to higher frequency at the same voltage and roughly with similar power consumption. Towards the end of this run, I found the CPU PPT to drop around 102 watts, making an average of about 105 watts for the entire run. Also, the core clocks were around 4.9 GHz on average. Okay, looks like we have surpassed 19,000 points in this run. It's quite amazing, almost 1,000 points increase by just enabling Curve Optimizer. And since we were thermally limited the whole time, a better cooler would be able to achieve much higher scores. Makes me actually wonder how much I will score if I switch to the WraithPrism's high-speed mode. And that's exactly what I'll be doing next. To switch to the high-speed mode, just flip the switch as I showed earlier. But doing so from within a build may prove a bit tricky, with the GPU not leaving much room in between. Hope I can do it without removing the GPU.
Alright, I was able to access the switch without taking apart my build. Now let's see what the high speed mode has to offer. The ideal fan speed has increased from about 2000 rpm to 2500 rpm. Let's see how it behaves under load. Also, since I didn't experience any instability in my system till now, I'm going to keep the PBO and Curve Optimizer settings of my previous run for now. Well, looks like we started with 5.1 GHz. And look at the fan speed, more than 3600 rpm. And let me tell you, it's quite audible. It's quite audible from here. The PPT is at around 114 watts for now, which of course will drop. Well, there is not much more to look at. Let's jump to the scores. So, the scores with cooler set at high speed is 19,189 points. The CPU PPT averaged to about 108 watts for the entire run. A decent score for the cooler and CPU combination, but the temperatures are still pretty high, and to address that, we will be moving to our final setup tweak. This time I'm going to set a manual PPT limit for my CPU. For that, change the PPU limits from motherboard to manual. The lower this value, the better will be the temps, but at a cost of performance, so don't starve your processor too much. I will set a value of 100 watts because the previous run averaged to around 108 watts. The value is set can be checked using Ryzen Master. Now I could have gone with 90 watts which would have improved temperatures further, but I wanted to remain close to the performance I got in the last run with a little bit of improvement in the temperatures. We start this run at 4.96 GHz with temperatures of around 85 degrees, hitting 100 watts of PPT limit. Now let's quickly move on to the score. As for the final score with these settings, I was able to hit 18,939 points with maximum temperature of about 88 degrees. I'm actually quite happy with these figures, and I might even use these settings for my day-to-day usage. You may say that the temps are still quite high. Now Cinebench is more of an extreme case scenario, which will give you an idea of your processor's performance while performing heavy multi-core tasks. However, while performing tasks like gaming, the temperature will usually be a lot better than what we have witnessed here. Also, my ambient temperature is too high today at 30 degrees. If you have better ambient temperatures, your CPU performance and temperatures will be a lot better than this. Lastly, a little bit of gaming. Let's compare if all these optimizations has brought about any noticeable benefit in gaming. It will be a short run of Hogwarts Legacy just to compare two different CPU settings from our testing earlier. I'll be keeping the resolution at 1080p native. The RS-9070 is the GPU that I have in my system, and I'll be using the Ultra preset with ray tracing turned off. So let's get into it. The Hogsmeade area of Hogwarts can be very CPU intensive, and I'm going to run around a little bit here and check the temperatures and performance. The CPU is clocking a steady 5.3 GHz, and as you can see, the GPU usage percentage is in the 80s, indicating CPU bottleneck. On the left, we have everything at stock settings, whereas on the right, the optimized settings is using Curve Optimizer at -30 and CPU PPT limited to 100 watts. The performance is more or less the same, although it looks like the optimized settings is getting a little bit of better performance. But what's worth mentioning is the CPU temps, which is about 3 to 4 degrees cooler on the right. So there is a little bit of noticeable benefit in gaming with all these tweaks, and it is basically free improvement just by playing a little bit with the BIOS settings. However, a word of warning: if you are not absolutely sure what you are doing, it is recommended not to play with the BIOS settings.
So there you have it, the Wraith Prism paired with the 7700 and tested at a bunch of different settings. So is the Wraith Prism usable with the Ryzen 7 7700 processor? Well, in my opinion, that depends on your use case. And I believe for most scenarios, the Wraith Prism is definitely usable with this processor, even if you're using your system for gaming. However, there will be of course some situations where the temperature will exceed what you are comfortable with, something that can be easily addressed by tweaking some of the settings of PBO and Curve Optimizer. But if you're someone who wants to run your processor at stock settings, you can definitely do that. But there will be situations where you may suffer some loss in performance. Of course, such situations will be very rare, and the loss in performance will not be that noticeable either. But if you are a content creator who wants to squeeze out every bit of performance from your processor, I would definitely recommend to look for some more premium cooling solutions, maybe even an AIO. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.